Hello and welcome to DY's banner review for September Legend Gala, where we have two new characters, one of whom I personally was not expecting, as a grand at least. We have Vane and we have Florence, two new characters. There's a few things to unpack here, and I'll leave Vane for last. So let's talk about Florence first today. So Florence is a dark permanent character, so you will be able to subtext her in the future, and she has some similarities to her other two versions with her crest mechanic. She doesn't have any super hyper offensive buffing capabilities like her light, but much like her wind version, she has some defensive things going on. So let's break down her kit. The main thing Florence really does is that she has this auto nuke. This particular skill here, I'm not even going to try pronounce that. Basically, it's a 2-hit dark damage nuke, which also inflicts these two debuffs. And while you have this particular skill up, the hit number doubles. Unfortunately, this is not it cast twice, which means you don't get double debuffs. It would have been nice that way, but at the very least, it's still more damage, so it's still nice. And yeah, like I said, it's activated by this buff here. Now, this has a really long cooldown at 10 turns. But the buff itself does last 5 turns, and the other thing is that whenever Florence receives a crest from another dark ally, it gets a 1-turn cut. So the actual cooldown for this will be a little bit lower, right? So clearly, Florence has some synergy with other crest users. So most notably in Dark, for crest support, we have Mana Diver, of course, we have Hecate or Hecate, and we also have Magisa as well. So those will be your main enablers for this sort of skill. And of course, if you happen to have Zossimos, then this particular passive will be activating a lot. Florence also gives this boost to Dark Allies defense based on how many crests you have, and this works from backline. So if you happen to be running a crest team, putting a backline, you'll get a bonus that way too. And then the final skill that is auto-activated whenever she gets a crest, I forgot to mention, is her second skill, which is a heal to the entire team and also some nice buffs. So if you have a crest team, I think Florence will be quite nice for that sort of playstyle. Now, that being said, I do think that Florence's kit overall isn't anything too particularly noteworthy, and it's going to be more of a for fun thing. And I don't think that she'll have any real meta relevant usage where she sort of can't be replaced by another character or anything like that. Most situations, I think you can just chuck in another character and be completely fine as well. So that is Florence out of the way, and let's go and talk about the big elephant in the room, which is the new grand character for Wind. We have Vane and his weapon Swan. Let's talk about the weapon first. So Swan, this weapon is basically Wind's version of Phoenix's weapon, Phoenix's torch, right? It's a main hand specific weapon. So right off the bat, you will only ever need one copy of this weapon. You don't need any more than that. We do see this new skill here, Verve, I think that's how you pronounce that. It gives HP and stamina. Now, these values aren't anything out of the ordinary. It's just regular medium stamina and medium HP, but it's just combined into one weapon skill. So some nice sort of defensive and offensive thing. It's very reminiscent of something like Vortex of the Void, but obviously lower. Now, the more exciting part, in air quotes, is his second and third skills. So let's talk about this. The second skill, it's very straightforward. Basically, whenever you use your S1 on your MC, your skill 1, you get damage mitigation and debuff immunity 1 time. So it gives some extra utility to whatever MC's first skill is. Depending on the situation, can be quite nice. It's a small defensive bonus, but nothing too crazy, right? This more important skill is definitely the second one, so let's talk about that. When main weapon, when a wind ally removes a buff, 3 hit wind damage to all foes, hit to wind defense stackable, and restore wind allies HP. So if you guys have seen Blazing Mistral, which is Fire's illustrious weapon, basically this weapon is extremely similar to that. Whenever you dispel a foe's buff and you have to dispel something, you can't just cast a dispel skill like Maria Theresa, you have to actually dispel something, then you get to do the auto nuke and all the other stuff that comes with it. The auto nuke is quite hefty. It seems like with a decent grid, it's hitting like 8 mil plus. And it can activate multiple times in a turn. So if you dispel 2 buffs, then you'll get 2 activations. I think, I haven't seen this verified, but normally that's how these skills work. If you dispel multiple buffs at once, so if you collect buffs or something, you probably only get 1 activation of it. Now, the thing about this skill is that, as mentioned, you have to dispel something. So it has a big condition. It's not sort of unconditional like Feeney's. Feeney's like, basically, once you have the condition, it activates all the time. This one, it requires the boss to actually do something, right? For example, if you're against a boss who doesn't buff themselves, then this weapon functionally doesn't really do much anymore, right? So in those situations, it's not very good. Fortunately, many of Earth's bosses do tend to buff themselves, right? So Bennu buffs himself, Sieg buffs himself, right? And then the other really notable one, of course, is Guild War. Guild War tends to have many, many buffs. So in those situations, this sort of weapon looks to be a fine full auto weapon for those situations. Now, the Dispel, you do get one on the charge attack here as well. The remove 1 buff effect and the bonus wind damage. Now, this is not Echo, it's an additional skill nuke on top. And the skill nuke is actually quite hefty too. It seems to do about like 4 to 5 mil damage, somewhere between there. So you can consider it like sort of like an extra charge attack. But yeah, overall, this weapon is definitely not as ubiquitous as something like Phoenix's Torch. It requires the boss to sort of play along and has to have the boss buff themselves. And then you have to have sources of Dispel to go along with it. So this weapon dispels on Ogi, but if you don't have the charge attack ready, then you need things like, whether that's like Esteriola, Galleon, the Lich, Vampy, list goes on and on. But you do need some other probably enabler to go alongside with it. I don't foresee this weapon being used outside of full auto too much. I do think that in very, very short burst rotation, so I'm talking like EX plus 0 button, maybe NM90, if the boss buff themselves, EX plus normally does, NM90 depends. In those situations, there is a chance that the skill nuke does a lot of extra damage and it will enable some very short rotations like that. But as mentioned, it really requires the boss to do the thing that you need it to do, right? So for that reason, it's inherently a little bit more niche. So yeah, overall, weapons not bad, but there's a reason we don't see Blazing Mistral too much, right? And even though this weapon is an axe, so on average, it tends to have better classes than Spear, like Blazing Mistral. Like most notably, we have things like Lumberjack, Berserker, Shield Swan, right? Those are probably the 3 biggest ones that are able to use this weapon. So in full auto and those classes, this weapon probably will see use if the boss has any sort of buffs. Either way, you only ever need 1 copy of this weapon, so at least that's something that's sort of nice to consider. Alright, so let's talk about Vane next. Vane is a tank sort of character who relies on taking lots and lots of damage to buff himself, essentially. He doesn't have too much team utility outside of that tanking capabilities. So his main important skill is his first skill. This one here is very similar to things like Summer Alexiel or Grand Vane. It is a 3-turn substitute all effect. These skills are typically quite good in HL in the past. It allows you to skip certain triggers depending on what the boss does. These days, there tends to be really negative effects, especially in V2 raids like Hexa or Far, if you skip triggers. So it depends, but for the most part, it does have some potential in HL. And with new raids coming out in October, I can definitely see this sort of skill being used, depending on what the boss does, of course. So only time will tell about that. Anyways, this skill here also upgrades to a different version, which does more damage. It does a mist effect. It only does hit to defense on the base form. And then it also gives damage mitigation to Vane, only Vane. And then it also does the sub-all and you get Undying as well. Now, to get this stronger version, you have to get Indomitable Conviction. Now, the way to get this is through his first passive down here. So let's take a quick read. When Vane is a main ally at the battle start, consume 30% of max HP, and he gets Undying 3 times, sort of like Sarasa. Shield effect to every other wind ally is 10,000, which is quite big. And then the way he gets the conviction stacks is upon withstanding lethal damage, raise conviction level by 1. So basically, what will ideally happen is that whenever you enter the battle, you will click S1 immediately, substitute all, and then ideally the boss is strong enough that within these 3 turns, the boss procs Undying 3 times. And by doing that, you get 3 conviction level, which basically allows you to cast his 3rd skill, which you can only use when his conviction level is 3. And that will fully heal him, remove all debuffs, and basically revive him to full, sort of like Feeney's S3, I guess. And then it also gives him a whole bunch of buffs. Now, the numbers on this are quite high. It's like 100% attack, 300% defense. So basically, it makes Vane extremely, extremely strong. But the condition is quite tough. Most raids in the game won't be able to proc this super early, right? The bosses just aren't strong enough. Right now, probably Sieg is the only one where you can maybe get this to happen. But one thing about Sieg is that if you substitute all his Quelfanger, then he actually changes your skill cooldown. So this skill will go on cooldown, and I'm not entirely sure if it comes back in time or if he's going to be left stranding on some turns, like while being on 0 HP basically. So that's something I'll have to keep an eye on and check in some Sieg setups once they come out. But for now, either way, this condition, the payoff seems good, but getting there will be sort of clunky or sort of impossible depending on who you're fighting. If you're fighting something weak, you're just never going to really be able to proc this in any timely fashion, which will feel really bad. But in places like Guild War or Sieg or some HL raids, you'll see this sort of like flowchart of skills happen, and it will probably be nice in that case, right? Now, the second skill here is very simple. It's a Dispel effect, and you also give Vane triple attacks. Now, the main significant thing about this skill is that it will auto-activate whenever he has conviction level 2. Here we go. Activate while beat at the end of turn. So once you've procced Undying twice, this will auto-activate at the end of turn. Dispel every turn, very, very good. Basically gives him triple attack every turn as well. Awesome. And then while you have S3, you will also heal, which is quite nice. And there's boost to healing specs at conviction level 3. So this will basically keep him as healthy as possible, I suppose. Now, Vane's second passive also gives him some extra things. The main things is that he has high hostility. I think the early calcs are that he has about a 40% chance of being targeted in the team. So that's decently high. He has high max HP to counteract that, and his damage is amplified based on how low it is. I believe it scales up to 20%. Now, the bonus here is that while you have S3, it is always 20% regardless of what his HP is, so it's no longer enmity scaling. So that's quite nice. Overall, Vane is looking to be a full auto character at the moment, and I expect to see him in higher level difficulty full autos in Guild War, so probably like NM200 and higher. His dispels at that point will be quite nice, and the tanking capabilities he brings will probably be quite useful, and those bosses tend to hit much harder, so you're going to actually be able to see Indomitable Conviction come out sooner than most raids in the game. So in those situations, I do think we will see Vane be used. I do think his design makes him inherently a little bit more niche. It's not just like, for example, Grand Vane, where you can just chuck her in and she does damage, you don't really care what the boss does. The fact that you sort of need the boss to play along a little bit. Sometimes, like, for example, if the boss has a turn where they just buff themselves, then like suddenly Vane is like taking longer to ramp and things might just fall out of place a little bit. So very likely the main spots we'll see him is Sieg, Guild War. Those are the 2 spots. I do think, however, that he has some future potential for HL raids. At the moment, Winter HL, so things like Hexa and Far is very much dominated by charge attack teams. So we're talking Kengo, Rising Force, and Chrysor. Vane, I think, is one piece of the puzzle for a future Wind HL sort of like archetype. which isn't as charge attack based. We do need more. I don't think Vane alone is enough for something like that at the moment, but any tools for that is more than welcome for me. So we'll see once the October CCW raids come out. That might be the first place where Vane gets to really shine. But for now, I do think he is mainly a full auto option, particularly for Guild War. So this banner has no other raid ups than Vane and Florence, and the only other thing to note here is that we have Andira as sparkable for the non-dragon zodiac. Monkey these days does not really see too much use, unfortunately. She was one of my early wind characters who carried me through the game, but these days there just tends to be a lot better options. It's not that she's bad, it's more that there are very, very competitive options in her slot. So we're talking characters like Grand Vane, Eternal Neo at level 130 or higher. We also have characters like Petra, and then just in general, just like strong attacking characters like, you know, Naru, Noir, Vampy, those sorts of things, right? So while Monkey isn't a horrible character by any stretch, she's quite decent. It's not something you should go out of your way to spark just because she has fallen a bit out of the meta. All right, so with all that out of the way, should you spark this banner? Absolutely not. No, do not spark this banner. And the main reason is because Vane is grand. I know there's Wind Guild War coming up, but I guarantee you, you probably won't need him. And the other thing is, if you really want Vane, it's better to spark Vane next month during Halloween. This is a weapon where you only need one copy, right? So it doesn't matter that he's raid up because you don't need multiple copies of this. You just need one, which means that you can just spark him in the future. So to summarize the upcoming banners before Wind Guild War, we have October Flash, which is where the new Halloween characters are introduced. And then we have October Legend, which is typically a all Halloween banner. October Legend will have Vane because Vane is a grand character, right? So in that banner, you'll have a chance at pulling Halloween characters, and at the end of your spark, you can spark Vane there. That is a much better option than sparking here. I'm a Wind main, I'm not sparking this banner. This banner is awful. It's worse than the Noir banner actually, because Noir at least you wanted multiple copies of a weapon. But this one, Vane, you only need one copy. There's no reason to spark here at all, especially with Halloween around the corner. I forgot to mention that after the Halloween Legend, there is a Legend October banner part 2 as well. That banner is no Halloweens, and it usually introduces a couple characters there as well. It's just like any other normal Legend banner. Anyways, I think that about covers it. Hope you guys enjoyed. Yesterday, I did upload the VOD for the GBF Confessional Volume 2. There was a lot of unhinged and crazy stories there, so if you haven't watched that, definitely go check that out. I'll leave a link in one of the cards on the screen somewhere here. All right, so thank you so much for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed. Good luck if you're pulling. Don't do it. And stay strong if you're saving. I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye. Bye-bye.